Imagine walking through a grand World's Fair in Paris or St. Louis at the turn of the 20th century. The air buzzes with excitement, music, laughter, and the hum of a modern world eager to show off its progress. Visitors marvel at the newest inventions, electric lights, automobiles, and towering monuments. But tucked between these wonders, a darker attraction draws massive crowds. Behind a wooden fence or within a small enclosure, human beings stand on display, men, women, and children brought from faraway lands. They are presented not as guests, but as living exhibits, representing what organizers called primitive cultures. People point, laugh, and take photographs, treating these individuals as curiosities rather than fellow humans. These were the human zoos, exhibitions that stripped people of their dignity and turned suffering into entertainment. Between the late 1800s and early 1900s, such displays appeared across Europe and America, from Berlin to London, from Paris to New York. Entire villages were reconstructed to mimic savage life, complete with huts, props, and native dress. The people inside were often kidnapped or coerced into participation, forced to perform their customs for the amusement of foreign audiences. To many Westerners of the time, these displays confirmed what colonial propaganda had long preached, that the non-European world was backward and needed the guidance of so-called civilization. Yet behind the fences and the staged smiles were real lives and real pain. Many of those displayed had families, languages, and traditions far richer than the world that exploited them cared to understand. Some, like Oda Benga of the Congo, were taken thousands of miles from home, promised a better life, only to be locked in cages and mocked by thousands. This is not just a story about the past, it is a mirror reflecting how prejudice and power once shaped the very idea of humanity. By revisiting these forgotten chapters, we remind ourselves of the cost of ignorance and the importance of empathy. If you believe history should never be erased, take a moment to like this video, share it with others, and subscribe to our channel. Together, we can bring light to the stories that the world tried to forget, and give voice to those who were once silenced. Across Europe and America in the late 19th century, a powerful illusion was being built, one that justified conquest, domination, and racial hierarchy. It was not created through war alone, but through spectacle. In cities like Paris, Brussels, and Berlin, the grand exhibitions of empire dazzled visitors with wonders from around the world, ivory from Africa, silk from Asia, spices from the Pacific. Yet hidden among the shimmering displays was something far more sinister: human beings, brought from distant lands, made to stand as living proof of a lie. To the public, these ethnological exhibitions were presented as science, education, and entertainment. Visitors were told they were witnessing the vast diversity of the human race, the progress of civilization. In truth, these displays were crafted to reinforce a single message: that the empire's power was both natural and moral. By portraying non-white people as primitive, Europe cast itself as the bringer of light to a dark world. Every smile, every staged ritual, every native hut built for these shows became a prop in the theater of superiority. The concept of civilizing the savage had deep roots. The rise of social Darwinism in the 19th century gave empire builders a convenient theory: that humanity was divided into races, each at a different stage of evolution. White Europeans, they claimed, stood at the pinnacle, while others, Africans, Asians, Pacific Islanders, were seen as lower forms of life, struggling to climb the ladder. This distorted science found its way into classrooms, newspapers, and even churches, shaping public opinion for generations. At the 1889 Paris Exposition, where the Eiffel Tower made its debut, visitors also found a Negro village with over 400 African men, women, and children. They were ordered to live as they supposedly did, in the wild, performing daily chores and dances for spectators. In the words of one French newspaper, it was the most curious display of the entire fair. But behind the fascination was dehumanization. The French public could admire the exotic, while convincing themselves that their nation's colonial rule was an act of benevolence. A few years later, in Belgium, the same scenes were repeated under the banner of King Leopold II's so-called mission to bring civilization to the Congo. In truth, His Congo Free State was one of the most brutal regimes in history, where millions perished under forced labor and violence. Yet in Brussels, the 1897 colonial exhibition invited visitors to stroll through a reconstructed Congolese village, complete with huts, crops, and natives. It was designed to show how far the Congolese had come under Belgian guidance, while the real Congo bled unseen thousands of miles away. Across the Atlantic, the United States was no different. The 1904 World's Fair in St. Louis featured what was called the Anthropology exhibit. Here, over 1,000 people from the Philippines, Africa, and other territories were displayed as living examples of human evolution's lower stages. They were forced to demonstrate their customs and crafts, as American visitors marveled at how civilized their own society seemed in comparison. Through these displays, entire empires built moral justification for conquest. By convincing citizens that colonization was a noble mission to uplift the uncivilized, they disguised greed and exploitation behind a facade of progress. School textbooks and scientific journals echoed the same message, ensuring that generations grew up believing the hierarchy of races was both natural and right. But even at the height of these exhibitions, there were those who saw through the illusion. Missionaries, abolitionists, and a few courageous journalists began to ask the questions no one else dared: what kind of civilization treats people as exhibits? What kind of progress requires others to be chained, displayed, and humiliated? The answer, though uncomfortable, was clear: these human zoos were not about understanding humanity. They were about defining who was allowed to be human. Paris, 1889. The city was alive with wonder. The grand boulevards shimmered under the glow of new electric lights, and at the center of it all, the Eiffel Tower, an iron giant reaching into the clouds, stood as a symbol of human achievement. The world had come to France to celebrate progress, science, and modernity. Millions flocked to the Exposition Universelle to see what the future might look like. But behind the excitement, beneath the sound of orchestras and the cheers of the crowd, another attraction whispered a darker truth about that so-called progress. Beyond the mechanical marvels and fine art galleries, visitors wandered toward a sprawling outdoor exhibit labeled The Native Villages. Here, on the edge of the fairgrounds, nearly 500 men, women, and children from Africa and Asia lived inside reconstructed settlements, small huts made of straw and wood, arranged to resemble the tribal villages of French colonies. To the fairgoers, it was a glimpse into the life of the uncivilized world. To those on display, it was captivity disguised as culture. Each morning, as Paris awoke to the hum of excitement, the residents of these artificial villages were ordered to perform their daily routines. Some cooked food over open fires, others carved wood, wove baskets, or danced when the crowd demanded it. Loudspeakers announced the schedule of performances. Children pointed and laughed. Artists sketched their faces, photographers sold their images on postcards. Newspapers described the display as both fascinating and educational, an opportunity for civilized Europe to observe humanity's earliest stages. The organizers called it anthropology. In truth, it was theater, a carefully crafted illusion that turned human lives into evidence for empire. By arranging these villages around the Eiffel Tower, the symbol of industrial progress, the exposition presented a contrast meant to flatter Europe. The message was clear: while France soared to new heights of science and reason, its colonies remained locked in the dawn of civilization. This narrative justified not only the expansion of empire but also the notion that colonization was a moral duty, gift of enlightenment to those deemed less advanced. Many of the people brought to Paris had no idea what awaited them. Some were promised work or education. Others were coerced or taken by force. Among them were Algerians, Senegalese, Cambodians, and Vietnamese, each uprooted from their home and culture to become part of this grand illusion. They endured the cold Parisian nights in makeshift huts, wearing traditional garments not suited for the European climate. Some fell ill. Few received proper medical care. When the fair ended, most were sent back to their colonies with little more than the memory of being watched, day after day, by strangers who saw them as curiosities. To the visitors, the native villages offered a thrill, a journey through continents without leaving Paris. They could stroll from an African hut to an Asian temple in a single afternoon, marveling at how different, how primitive, these lives appeared. But to historians today, the 1889 exposition stands as a stark symbol of how culture can be twisted to serve power. It was not merely an exhibition of art and technology, it was a stage on which empire performed its own righteousness. While the Eiffel Tower became an enduring monument to innovation, the villages beneath it told another story, one that was meant to be forgotten. Behind the laughter and applause, behind the sketches and songs, were individuals with their own names, families, and dreams. They were not relics of a distant past but living people, forced to play roles written by others. The Paris Exposition remains a paradox of history, the celebration of human progress built upon the humiliation of humanity itself. Far from the glittering cities of Europe, the story often began in silence. In small villages across Africa, Asia, and the Pacific, recruiters, sometimes soldiers, sometimes traders, arrived with promises of opportunity. They spoke of travel, of new lands where culture and talent would be admired. For some, curiosity and hope led them to accept. For others, there was no choice at all. When the ships sailed back toward Europe, they carried not only spices and goods from distant colonies, but also men, women, and children who had become part of a different kind of cargo, one meant for display. The journey itself was long and punishing. Many traveled weeks across seas they had never seen before, confined in cramped quarters, uncertain of what awaited them. Some thought they were going to perform their crafts or share their traditions, others realized too late that they had been deceived. By the time they reached their destination, Berlin, Paris, London, or New York, the reality unfolded like a cruel stage play. They were to live behind fences, wear the clothing chosen for them, and perform the parts others had written. The conditions were harsh, often unbearable. Winter in Europe was foreign and unforgiving to those from warmer climates. Thin garments offered little protection from the cold. Some were forced to live in replicas of huts made from straw and mud, built not for comfort but for spectacle. Food was rationed, privacy was almost non-existent, and illness spread easily among the confined spaces. Yet every morning, they were told to smile, to sing, to dance, to reenact their daily lives for the endless stream of spectators who came to gawk and take photographs. They were not introduced by name but by tribe, region, or race, labels that erased individuality. Posters and programs described them as wild, exotic, or untamed. To the audience, these words made the experience feel safe, even thrilling. They could imagine themselves explorers, witnessing the distant corners of the world without ever leaving their city. But for those on display, the audience's amusement came at the cost of their humanity. Every laugh, every curious stare, was a reminder that they were no longer seen as people, but as performances. Some tried to resist in quiet ways. A few refused to dance, sat in silence, or looked away from the crowd. Others whispered their real names to one another at night, clinging to fragments of identity. For them, memory became an act of defiance, remembering who they were before they became exhibits. A few stories survived, carried through letters or journals written by missionaries, journalists, or sympathetic observers who witnessed the cruelty firsthand. They described the exhaustion, the humiliation, and the moments when the performer's humanity broke through the spectacle, like when a mother shielded her child from the flash of a photographer's camera, or when a man stopped mid-performance, refusing to continue until his friend received water. When the fairs ended, many participants were simply left behind. Some found their way home, while others died far from it, buried in foreign soil without their families ever knowing what had happened. Their names rarely appeared in the official records of the exhibitions, they existed only as numbers, part of attendance counts or profit reports. Behind the festive posters and triumphant speeches about progress, these stories reveal a different reality, one of coercion, endurance, and forgotten voices. The so-called exhibitions of culture were, in truth, exercises of control. They reduced entire peoples to images and gestures, turning life itself into a spectacle for entertainment. And though the applause eventually faded, the echo of that exploitation lingered long after the lights of the exhibitions went dark. The crowds came in waves, families, students, soldiers on leave, couples in their finest clothes, all eager to witness the newest spectacle of the modern age. From the cobblestone streets of Paris to the great parks of London and the bustling avenues of New York, people lined up for hours, tickets in hand, their eyes filled with anticipation. Posters promised a glimpse of the exotic, a journey through the unknown, or the wonders of distant lands. The fairs and exhibitions called themselves educational, but beneath the language of curiosity lay something far more complex, a fascination built upon difference, and a comfort found in superiority. In an age of empire and industrial progress, Europe and America saw themselves as the center of the civilized world. The exhibitions fed this belief, transforming human diversity into theater. Visitors marveled at machines that could fly and lights that could shine without fire, then wandered into sections where entire villages had been recreated, complete with huts, tools, and people from Africa, Asia, or the Pacific Islands. The same public that celebrated scientific advancement also indulged in seeing others portrayed as relics of a primitive past. It was a contradiction that few recognized and even fewer questioned. Newspapers praised these displays as cultural triumphs. Writers described them with the language of wonder, authentic, fascinating, educational. But between the lines, the reports carried a different message, that progress belonged to some, while others existed to be observed. The crowds did not come merely to learn, they came to confirm what they had already been taught, that the world beyond Europe's borders was mysterious, beautiful, and in need of guidance. Photographers captured smiling faces, unaware that the smiles often masked exhaustion. Postcards featuring these images sold by the thousands, becoming souvenirs of empire that could be mailed across continents. Children collected them like treasures, their curiosity shaped by what they saw, an illusion of difference presented as truth. For many in the audience, this was their only encounter with people from other cultures, and it was one filtered entirely through the lens of performance and control. The atmosphere at these exhibitions was a mix of awe and distance. Spectators leaned over railings, whispering to each other about the way people dressed, how they moved, how they spoke. To them, it was a lesson in the diversity of mankind, yet the setup made one point unmistakably clear: those inside the fences were exhibits, and those outside were observers of the civilized world. The boundary between the two was both physical and symbolic, a quiet but powerful statement about who belonged where. Historians would later describe these crowds as victims of ignorance, shaped by the ideologies of their time. But to understand the past, it is important to see the emotional force that drove them there. Curiosity was genuine, people wanted to know about distant places. Yet their understanding of those places was limited to what empire allowed them to see. The exhibitions didn't just entertain, they taught, subtly and persistently, that the world was a hierarchy, with Europe and America standing proudly at the top. As the lights dimmed each evening and the visitors returned home, they carried stories of what they had witnessed, tales of exotic people, strange rituals, and faraway lands. Around dinner tables and in classrooms, these stories were repeated, shaping generations of thought. What began as fascination evolved into a worldview, one that would take decades to unravel. The crowds believed they were seeing the world. In truth, they were seeing a reflection of their own assumptions, a mirror polished by empire, showing them not the truth of others, but the comfort of their own imagined superiority. As the 20th century unfolded, the applause that once filled the exhibition grounds began to fade. The lights of the world fairs dimmed, and the great cities that had once celebrated human displays turned their attention elsewhere. Yet not everyone could forget. Among the crowds who had once watched in fascination, a few voices began to rise, soft at first, then stronger with time, questioning what had been accepted for decades. These were the writers, the thinkers, and the activists who refused to look away from the suffering hidden behind the spectacle. Their challenge began quietly. A handful of journalists visited the exhibitions and returned disturbed by what they saw. They described the fatigue in the eyes of the performers, the thin blankets in their huts, the cold air that cut through the laughter of the crowds. Their articles did not shout accusations, they asked questions. What does it mean to call this education? How can we celebrate progress while treating people as curiosities? The words reached newspapers and drawing rooms, unsettling readers who had never before considered the human cost of their amusement. Among the earliest critics were missionaries and scholars who had traveled through the colonies themselves. They had seen the richness of the cultures now being mocked and simplified for display. To them, these exhibitions were not lessons in anthropology but acts of exploitation dressed as science. One observer wrote that no civilized nation should claim enlightenment while turning life into a cage. Such statements were radical for their time, challenging not only public entertainment but the very foundation of imperial thought. In Paris, Berlin, and London, small circles of intellectuals began to discuss the ethics of these fairs. They debated whether it was possible to study humanity without demeaning it. Some argued that these displays distorted truth, feeding stereotypes instead of understanding. Others pointed to the growing movements for equality and asked how nations could speak of liberty while denying it so openly to others. The questions multiplied, spreading from salons to newspapers, from classrooms to parliaments. As more people spoke out, evidence of mistreatment became harder to ignore. Photographs revealed the conditions behind the fences: cramped quarters, inadequate food, children playing barefoot in the cold. Former participants began to share their stories, sometimes through interpreters, sometimes through letters. They spoke of promises broken, of loneliness, of being treated as less than human. Each testimony added weight to the growing sense of unease. Artists, too, joined the cause. Painters and writers began to challenge the romanticized image of empire. They depicted not the glory of conquest, but its consequences, the silence of those made invisible, the dignity stripped away by curiosity. Their work reached galleries and theaters, giving form to the guilt that many had tried to suppress. By the early decades of the 20th century, the world was changing. Wars had shaken the illusion of Western superiority, and voices from colonized nations were beginning to demand recognition. Activists connected the exhibitions to a larger system of control, arguing that the same mindset that built the human zoos also justified domination abroad. What had once been seen as harmless entertainment now appeared as a symbol of moral blindness. Some exhibitions closed quietly, others with public debate. Organizers defended them as history, as tradition, as science, but the tide of opinion was turning. The same newspapers that had once praised the shows began publishing critiques. Politicians faced questions about the ethics of empire, and anthropologists sought new ways to study culture without humiliation. The transformation was slow, uneven, and incomplete. Yet it marked a turning point. Where once there had been silence, there was now awareness. The critics had forced the world to look beyond the fences, to see not the illusion of difference, but the shared humanity that had always been there, waiting to be acknowledged. Today, if you walk through the grand halls of most museums or open the pages of a standard history textbook, you'll find proud stories of progress, monuments of invention, tales of empire, and charts of human achievement. There are timelines of wars and revolutions, maps showing the spread of trade and exploration, and portraits of thinkers who shaped the modern world. Yet somewhere between these polished narratives, an unsettling silence remains. The chapter about human zoos, about the exhibitions that once turned people into displays, is missing. It is as if the world decided that some parts of its past were better left in the shadows. This silence did not happen by accident. After the exhibitions ended and the last crowds dispersed, societies began to clean their conscience as carefully as they dismantled the pavilions. The photographs that had once been sold on postcards were tucked away in archives. The newspapers that had praised the spectacles no longer mentioned them. When new museums were built to celebrate culture and science, the curators often chose not to include the uncomfortable reminders of how both had once been misused. The result was a carefully edited history, one that highlighted the achievements of civilization while erasing the cost of its illusions. Teachers spoke of the world fairs as triumphs of innovation, but rarely mentioned that they had included fenced-off villages of real people forced to perform for foreign audiences. In classrooms, children learned about the Eiffel Tower as a symbol of progress, but not about the men, women, and children who lived beneath it as part of the 1889 exposition's native villages. Museums displayed the artifacts of distant cultures, masks, tools, carvings, yet often failed to acknowledge the human lives that had been exhibited alongside them. For decades, this selective memory shaped how nations saw themselves. It allowed former colonial powers to celebrate their global influence without confronting the exploitation that made it possible. Silence became a form of protection, a way to preserve pride while avoiding guilt. And so, generation after generation, the story of human zoos slipped further from public awareness, buried beneath layers of national identity and cultural comfort. But history has a way of resurfacing. In the late 20th century, researchers began to uncover forgotten archives, photographs, letters, and first-hand accounts that revealed what had been hidden. Scholars traced the lives of individuals who had been taken from their homes and displayed in European capitals. Some of their descendants, discovering these records for the first time, demanded acknowledgement and justice. Slowly, exhibitions that once glorified empire began to be re-evaluated. A few museums dared to tell the truth, setting up small installations that confronted the legacy of the human displays. Visitors stood before the images, stunned, realizing that these events had not taken place in some distant barbaric age, but within the same era that produced cinema, electricity, and the modern city. Yet even today, the topic remains uneasy. Many institutions hesitate to address it, fearing controversy or discomfort. Schoolbooks still offer only fragments of the story, if they mention it at all. The reluctance reveals something deeper: societies prefer to remember their triumphs, not their transgressions. To admit the existence of human zoos is to question the very foundation of the idea of progress, to confront how modernity was built upon hierarchy and dehumanization. Still, the silence is beginning to break. Historians, filmmakers, and educators are starting to bring these forgotten stories into public view. They remind us that the measure of civilization is not only in its inventions or monuments, but in how honestly it faces its past. For every page that was once torn from history, there are voices now insisting that it be restored. And when those voices are finally heard, the story of human zoos becomes not just a tale of cruelty, but a lesson in remembrance, the proof that truth, however buried, will always find a way to return to the light. History is often told as a story of progress, a march toward enlightenment, equality, and understanding. Yet within that march lie shadows, moments when humanity lost its way. The story of the human zoos is one of those shadows, a reflection of how curiosity, when guided by arrogance, can turn compassion into spectacle. To remember these events is to face not only what happened, but also what it reveals about the world that allowed it. It is a mirror held up to history, showing that cruelty does not always announce itself with violence, sometimes it hides behind fascination, science, or art. When we look back on those exhibitions today, the question is not simply how such things could have happened, but how easily they were accepted. The photographs of the crowds remind us that injustice is not sustained by a few, it survives through silence, through the comfort of those who choose not to see. And so, remembering becomes an act of courage. To tell these stories aloud is to break the chain of denial that once disguised humiliation as discovery. Each face behind the fences, each name lost in the archives, speaks to a truth larger than any single exhibition. They remind us that dignity cannot be measured by culture, color, or creed. They remind us that progress means nothing if it does not include empathy. The past cannot be changed, but it can be understood, and in that understanding lies the power to build a different future. In many ways, the echo of those human zoos still lingers in the world today, in how societies view difference, in how history is told, and in whose voices are heard or silenced. By acknowledging this legacy, we do more than correct the record, we reclaim the humanity that was once denied. Remembering does not reopen wounds, it allows them to heal honestly. The lessons of that era are not just about cruelty, but about awareness. They remind us that dignity must be protected not only in grand moments of history, but in everyday life, in the way we speak, teach, and treat one another. The fences of the past may be gone, but the responsibility to prevent their return lies with all of us. If this story has moved you, take a moment to keep the conversation alive. Like this video, share it with others, and subscribe to the channel. Together, we can continue uncovering the chapters history tried to hide, and make sure that the mistakes of the past are never repeated.